Good morning. This is Alana Mueller with Kauffman FastTrac. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for the next in our series from the Kauffman FastTrac Author Series. It's a real treat for me today to welcome my friend Brad Feld to the FastTrac Author Series. Brad has been an early-stage investor in Entrepreneurial since 1987. Prior to co-founding Foundry Group, he co-founded Mobius Venture Capital, and prior to that, founded Intensity Ventures, a company that helped launch and operate software companies. Brad is also co-founder of Techstars. Brad currently serves on the boards of directors of many companies, and previously Brad was an executive at Ameridata Technologies after it acquired Feld Technologies, a firm he founded in 1987 that specialized in custom software applications. In addition to his investing efforts, Brad has been active with several nonprofit organizations and currently is chair of the National Center for Women and Information Technology, co-chair of Startup Colorado, and on the boards of Startup Weekend and the Application Developers Alliance. Brad is a nationally recognized speaker on the topics of venture capital investing and entrepreneurship, and writes the widely read blogs Feld Thoughts and Ask the VC. Brad holds Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in Management Science from MIT, and Brad is also an avid art collector and long-distance runner. He's completed 22 marathons as part of his mission to run a marathon in each of the 50 states. Today, Brad will share insights on how entrepreneurial ecosystems are driving innovation and energy from his new book, Startup Communities, which was just released yesterday. Please join me in welcoming Brad Feld.
Thanks a ton for having me.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk for 20 or 30 minutes on startup communities and the dynamics around creating a long-term sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystem. And then I want to make sure that we have some time on this call for any Q&A that folks have. And my sense is that if you have questions along the way, all you need to do is put them into the GoToMeeting seminar box, or you could also email them to brad@feld.com during the call, and I'll probably pick them up from that as well. So let me start by talking about my journey to the book. I want to then spend some time talking about the 4 principles of a startup community, which I call the Boulder Thesis. And then I want to relate it into specific things that I think people that are interested in building a long-term, vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem can do wherever they want. So my premise starts with this notion that you can create a startup community anywhere in the world. I think that any major city can support a startup community that develops and builds over a long period of time. There's often been a mythology or sort of the meme that goes around that if you want to start a technology company, you have to be in Silicon Valley. And I just reject that. I reject the notion that you have to choose a place to live to go build something. I think you should do it the other way around. You should choose where you want to live and then build your life around that. My wife, Amy, and I moved to Boulder in 1995 from Boston. Boston wasn't home for either of us. We went to school there. I created a company there. The two of us, developed obviously a relationship there and had a good experience there. But it wasn't home. I was from Dallas, Texas. She was from Alaska. And the Northeast was fine and it was good to us, but Boston wasn't where we wanted to spend our life. We searched pretty deliberately for different places, and we found Boulder. Going to Boulder was kind of random for us. We didn't know anybody in Boulder when we moved there. There's one person in Boulder that was somebody that we were acquainted with. He moved away relatively soon. By 1995, when we moved, I was already making angel investments. I was making angel investments after I'd sold my first company on the East Coast and the West Coast. So I was spending a lot of time in Boston, a lot of time in New York, a lot of time in San Francisco, a lot of time in Seattle, and a lot of time in Los Angeles, and had investments in all of those different cities, which all had great entrepreneurial activity going on. And I really had no expectation that I would do anything in Boulder other than live there. I would travel around during the week like I have for a long time, and I'd end up at home on the weekends and maybe be there Fridays and Mondays, and that would be where we built our life. And what happened was I found very quickly that there was a very neat and powerful startup community that was already in Boulder Boulder had a long history of entrepreneurial activity dating back to the 1960s and 1970s in a number of different areas: biotech, storage, telecommunications, and natural foods were kind of the obvious places that you sort of found as an early visitor to Boulder. But really in the mid-90s, the internet was very powerful in the context of Boulder because Boulder is a very, very smart, very wired community. It's only 100,000 people, but it's very counterculture. It's college town. I like to say the hippies that were traveling to the West Coast in the 1960s when they ran out of gas before they got to San Francisco. If they ran out of gas in Boulder, they just looked around and said, we'll stay here. So you had this sort of substrate of the city that was already organized and built around the notion of creatives and the creative class, which Richard Florida has done such a great job of articulating. What I experienced over the last 17 years was this incredible, incredible journey of watching a number of different entrepreneurs in Boulder, including me, work and build what is now regarded as one of the best startup communities in the world, and a very, very powerful one, especially in the domain of software and internet, which is where I play. If you look at Boulder today, while it's a city of only 100,000 people, so it's a relatively small town, it probably has, on a per capita basis, the greatest density of entrepreneurial activity anywhere in the country. So the largest number of entrepreneurs and people working for startups over the working population, if that's the math that we use. So that's powerful. And the journey for the book, for me, was to figure out why that happened. And not just to do it in the context of Boulder, but to try to understand it in the context of lots of other places and how what had happened in Boulder could be applied to lots of other startup communities, hence the book. In 2010, I started thinking about this really hard. I was a co-founder in 2006 of something called Techstars with David Cohen. For those of you that aren't familiar with Techstars, it's a mentor-driven accelerator that started in Boulder but now has programs that run in New York, Boston, Seattle, and San Antonio, and has also created and is part of something called the Global Accelerator Network, which is an affiliation of accelerators all around the world. An accelerator, to define it, a mentor-driven accelerator, which is what Techstars is a 90-day program where entrepreneurs get a little bit of money on the front end. We give them $120,000 in exchange for a small amount of their company. We take 6% of their company in common stock, so it looks, the accelerator takes it, so it looks like a co-founder of the company. And the companies go through a full-time immersive 90-day program where they come out the other end with a business that's a fundable company in many cases. And it's been remarkable. We've now had about 200 companies go through Techstars specifically. The success of not just the companies themselves, but the program in terms of being part of the fabric of the local community around startup activity. And it's just one of many, but it caused me to really think about it because I was experiencing this now in multiple cities. When I wrote the book, I came up with the following framework, which I call the Boulder Thesis, which are the 4 principles that you need to be able to have a long-term sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystem. So I'll go through them first, and then I'm going to explain each of them. The 4 principles are: first, entrepreneurs have to lead. Second, they have to take a very long-term view. Third, they have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in any way in the startup community. And fourth, you have to have a series of activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack over a period of time. So let's start with the first one. I separate the constituents in the startup community into 2 categories: leaders and feeders. And I talk about them extensively in the book at the beginning. Both are important, but they're different, and they play different roles. Leaders are the entrepreneurs. Feeders are everyone else. They're government, university, big business, venture capitalists, angel investors, service providers like lawyers and accountants, nonprofits that are helping entrepreneurship, economic development. All of these folks are feeders. Again, feeders are important, but they're different. Individual feeders, individual people in the feeder category can provide leadership roles in different activities. But in the absence of having a critical mass of entrepreneurial leaders, your startup community won't make any progress. And there's a couple of very fundamental reasons for that, and I'll touch on them as sort of we go through the other 3 principles. The key thing is that it's not that every entrepreneur has to be a leader. It's that you have to have a critical mass. And when I look back in Boulder into 1995, there were probably a dozen entrepreneurs I could point to that have played a leadership role and have been leaders of the Boulder startup community over the last 20 years or so, 15, 20 years. These leaders are different in stature, and they take on different things. They're not organized structurally as a hierarchy. So there is no president of the Boulder startup community. There is no vice president of membership. There's no vice president of education. There's no CFO. It's a network of people, a network of entrepreneurs who are doing different things and interconnected throughout the community. And this is an important distinction between leaders and feeders. Most feeders are hierarchical organizations. Think about government or university or a big business. They tend to have a very well-defined hierarchy that has value and importance in the context of that, but is very, very different than the way entrepreneurs work in a network, and frankly, how a startup community has to function, which is really as a network. The second point is that you have to take a very long-term view. I like to say a generational view or a 20-year view. The reason for the long-term view is that the development of a startup community is something that just takes a long time. If you look at Silicon Valley, it's 60, 70 years into its evolution as a startup community. One of the things that happens, and is happening again now, is that entrepreneurship and startups get exciting, and all of a sudden it looks like a path of positive economic development in cities, and lots of people get involved in it. Government gets involved in it. University gets re-engaged in it. People sort of come out of the woodwork and get excited about how can they help startups. Politicians are talking about how entrepreneurship is the future, and these things are all true. But the macro that we're living in might change. Politicians run on a 2 to 4 year cycle, whether they're local or national. They're focused on getting elected in the next 4-year cycle. So maybe they do 2 or 3 productive years before the election cycle, or even 1 productive year before the election cycle. Universities tend to run on 1-year cycles, as well as anybody who's ever been an associate professor knows very well the 7-year tenure track cycle. If you think about the entrepreneurial cycle, most companies take 10 to 20 years to develop as businesses, and some can take longer. And sure, there are some overnight successes that happen in 2 or 3 years, but there's lots of overnight successes that entrepreneurs toiled away for 10 or 15 years before the magic happened and the company became super successful. So the idea of having a very long-term view about what you're doing is critically important. And that long-term view has to supersede all of the macro dynamics, the ups and downs of the economy, whatever comes in and out of favor, whoever the president is, or whoever is in Congress, or whoever your governor is, and whatever the governor's new economic development plans are. All of those things, again, are useful and components of the startup community, but they're not the leadership dynamic, and this reinforces why the entrepreneurs have to be leaders. They have to be leaders. They have to take a very, very long-term view. The third is that they have to be, and the community has to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage. So I come back to this notion that leaders and feeders are both important. It's not that leaders are important and feeders aren't, or it's not that there's a special magic role. It's that they both are very, very key, and you have to be willing as a leader in the startup community to embrace anyone who wants to get involved. And anybody who's providing any sort of leadership in the startup community has to embrace that. So what does that mean? If any of you ever want to come to Boulder or have ever been to Boulder, you've probably experienced this. One of the things that happens multiple times a day is I get an email from somebody who says, I'd like to get plugged into Boulder, or I'm coming to visit Boulder because I have, an event. A friend's getting married, a kid is having a sporting event, I'm tired of where I'm living and I just want to explore something new. My business has sent me on a trip because I've got to go somewhere for that. And I want to find out more about what's going on and get plugged into the startup community. I will typically ask the person a clarifying question to understand what they actually do and what they're looking for. And when I find that person, understand that person a little bit better, I then send an email out to a dozen people that I think are going to be relevant for them to get together with. Of those dozen people, maybe 4 or 5 of them respond immediately. A couple of them are unavailable. And those 4 or 5, if they can get together with the person, they do. But they then also look in their network for other people to connect with. And so we use this very informal, very lightweight way of enabling people to get engaged, in what's going on in the startup community and to visit it. Another example would be somebody who wants to play a leadership role. One of the neat things about playing a leadership role in the startup community is that you don't have to ask anybody permission. You just start doing things. And so a lot of people show up and say, well, I want to get involved and I want to do blah. Well, there is no vice president of education. So if the person wants to do an event or they want to start an activity or they want to organize a group of people, the answer is just do it. One more example that I have is that we have a lot of people that move to Boulder now because Boulder has become so visible, and they're constantly looking for, a lot of them are looking for jobs in startups. What we want to do is when they come to town, we want to make it really easy for them to find jobs in startups. So we have an informal CEO email list that I'm one of 2 curators on. We literally do nothing other than admit people in that are CEOs of Boulder-based companies. And when somebody says they're coming to Boulder or sends us a resume and says they're looking for a job in Boulder, we send it out to the list. No, we didn't ask permission. We didn't have to create anything. We literally just started it. And the number of jobs that have come from that list in startups is incredible. And the power is for the startups, it's a very high velocity way to get new recruits into the system, which brings in fresh blood into the community. So I could give you lots of other examples. There are plenty in the book. But this notion of being inclusive of anyone who wants to engage is super important. The last is this concept of having activities and events that happen on a continual basis. When I talk about activities and events, I'm not talking about Entrepreneur of the Year award. I'm not talking about a cocktail party that somebody has at their house. I'm not talking about the Chamber of Commerce event that happens to talk about economic development. Those things are fine, and they're part of the dynamic of any startup community. However, they really don't enable entrepreneurs and people who are interested in entrepreneurship to do things with each other. And so what I mean are things like Techstars, which I described earlier. It's a 90-day program that allows entrepreneurs and mentors and all of the leaders of the startup community to engage and as companies get created. Or something like Startup Weekend, which I'm on the board of and Kauffman's been a huge supporter of from inception, which is this 54-hour weekend simulation of entrepreneurship. And if you're interested in being an entrepreneur or having the experience of being an entrepreneur, doing a startup weekend is an incredible opportunity, and it's phenomenal what it is. The other side of it is just as powerful, which is if you're an existing entrepreneur and you're looking for other people to work with, whether you're looking for partners or people to join your company early in its life, it's a fantastic place to go find people who are interested in working for startup companies. Other examples might be a monthly new tech meetup that happens on a recurring basis every month. Something like Ignite or TEDx, Open Coffee Club, where every Tuesday morning a set of entrepreneurial leaders meet at the same place, and it's open to anybody who wants to show up. You might look at any one of these individual things and say, coffee club meeting, what's that? And that doesn't sound very important. Any one of them by themselves aren't important. What's important is to have a continual set of these. Have them be emergent. So they're led by entrepreneurs. They're not things that are structured. They're not membership fee organizations. They're not things that have lots of overhead to put on. They're just stuff that's continually happening, and continually happening in a way where it engages entrepreneurs in doing things with each other. Is inclusive of anybody who wants to participate, so inclusive of the entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, all the local service providers, anybody in the feeder category. Happen over a long period of time, 20+ years. So they're not things that happen for 2 or 3 months and then disappear, but they're things that just happen week after week, month after month, year after year. And sure, some of them won't sustain long term. Some of them disappear because they weren't good ideas. It has to be super easy for any entrepreneur who wants to provide a leadership role to be able to start one of those activities and events and just do it. Not ask for permission, not have someone tell them it's okay, not have to raise a bunch of money to get started. Just get started. So those are the 4 principles of the Boulder thesis. Entrepreneurs have to lead. You have to take a very long-term view. You have to be inclusive of anybody who wants to engage. And you have to have activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack. Let's scope up a level. Why are these things so powerful? So when I think about the ethos that exists in Boulder today, and when I look at highly functioning startup communities that I'm involved in other parts of the country, there's a couple of principles and a couple of behaviors, sorry, not principles, behaviors that you see over and over again. One of them is a behavior we call in Boulder, give before you get, and I hear lots of other people referring to it as pay it forward. The world is separated into mentors and advisors. There's two different categories of things, and I want to describe what they both are because they often are conflated, and they define this notion of give before you get. A mentor says, how can I be helpful to you? An advisor says, if you give me 1% of your company, I'll be an advisor. Or if you give me 5% of the cash I raise for you, I'll help you raise a round. Or if you give me, $2,000 a month, I can provide part-time, blah, blah, blah. The world needs a lot more mentors than advisors. And there's a role for advisors, but what we really need is a lot more mentors, a lot more people who say, how can I be helpful? Without an expectation of what's going to come back on the back end to them. Now, if you wander around the Boulder startup community, you will hear this all the time. It is the language that is used. How can I be helpful? And it puts the responsibility for defining what you need on the entrepreneur rather than having it be an ambiguous thing. People are also very comfortable saying, I don't think I can help that way. So if I say to somebody, how can I help you? And they say, give me $10 million, I say, well, actually, I can't do that. But is there any other way I can be helpful? Now, it might be that I could give them $10 million if I wanted to invest in their company. But you don't engage a mentor that way. You engage a mentor through a relationship that hopefully becomes a peer relationship. So you try to wire into this fabric this notion of everybody giving before they get. Doesn't mean that nobody asks for anything, but they're constantly trying to put back into the system. And I behave this way now for my entire professional life, adult life. And the amount that I have gotten back unexpectedly, both economic and emotional, and intellectual, so exceeds the amount that I put in. It's startling. And the most magical moments happen when you get something completely unexpected from somebody that you helped in the past. Or even more powerfully, you hear how somebody that you helped in the past has had a profound impact on some other entrepreneur's life and arc because they internalize this notion, I help them, they help somebody else. And this came to me because early on in my entrepreneurial arc, when I was running my first company, I had several mentors who were unbelievably giving of their time and energy to me without any expectation. So this notion of give before you get, I think, is a fundamental tenet that has to get wired in. Another is the notion that we're not playing a zero-sum game. The idea of a zero-sum game is there's winners and losers. We're so far from saturation point in terms of startups and startup activities in this country that the idea that we're playing a zero-sum game doesn't make any sense. So I really encourage people to very, very strongly play non-zero-sum games, where within the startup community, your goal is to have everyone win. Now, you'll have conflicts. There's always bad actors. There's occasionally competitive dynamics between companies. That's fine. That's natural, and you sort of deal with that. But if you come at it with this orientation of everybody that participates and is adding into the system is increasing what's happening over this long period of time, you end up with this very, very powerful frame of reference, which is one where you're not playing a zero-sum game. The last thing I'd like to toss in the mix are a couple of classical problems that I talk about in the book, and I'll just give you two of them. And I go through a whole series of them and how to think about them. But as I wander around, I hear the same things over and over again. People say, well, that's fine, that won't work here because, or we're special and therefore different rules apply. And my own experience is that everybody's special, but that doesn't mean that the principles don't apply. And in fact, it's almost the opposite, that this construct of startup communities, the idea that you can't do it because of a set of reasons is just simply false. And it comes back to this notion that I believe that you can do this anywhere in the world. The two really easy sort of classical problems to address are something I call the patriarch problem and something I call the complaining about capital problem. Start with the patriarch problem. The patriarch problem is one that probably some people on this call have experienced. I've certainly experienced it, where in a city, the way the city works is that there's some very, very successful, I like to call them industrialists. They might be entrepreneurs, they might be business people, they might be politicians that were once business people, but the business activity of the community is controlled by a set of patriarchs. When I'm not feeling particularly generous, I like to say it's the old white guy problem. It's a bunch of people who have been very, very successful and are trying to control the system of what's going on. Then you have this next generation of entrepreneurs who are not connected in. They are frustrated. They don't feel like asking for permission, or they don't get the person's blessing because they approach things differently, or they dress differently, or they think differently, or they have a cultural norm that's different, or they're new to the city and they haven't, quote, earned their stripes yet, or whatever. Those entrepreneurs in a lot of communities get stifled by the patriarchs. And my recommendation is a very simple one, which is that the startup community should simply ignore the patriarchs. What happens is when you start ignoring the patriarchs, you don't ask for permission. You just do stuff. You get things done. You start companies. You create activities. You create events. You create this network engagement model and this dynamic where lots of stuff is happening. An interesting thing happens. Some of the patriarchs are awesome. They're just awesome people. And they look at what's going on and they say, wow, there's something cool going on over there. I want to go play with those guys and gals. And they come down off of the hill, sort of metaphorical hill, and they engage. And they engage often as leaders, but they don't try to control what's happening. And then a few more people that are the friends of the patriarchs see the patriarchs having a blast over here doing this other stuff, and they say, well, that's a lot of fun. I better get involved in that. And they come over. And some of the patriarchs don't ever engage, and that's fine. But what you do is you change the dynamic from a hierarchy to a network. You change the dynamic from a situation where you feel like you have to ask the patriarchs permission, or you have to get their blessing, or you have to get their money, or you have to get their support, to one where you're just doing stuff, and the ones that want to engage in the network do. I've seen that happen over and over again, and there's huge, magnificent examples of that in places like the Bay Area in Silicon Valley, but plenty of others around the country. And you see it happening in some next-generation cities that are evolving very rapidly. Portland immediately comes to mind. Austin comes to mind. I'm talking to you today from Chicago. It's happening here in Chicago, same kind of dynamic. So very, very powerful shift. The second classical problem is this notion of complaining about capital. Everywhere I go, entrepreneurs say there's not enough capital here. And I hear, well, we don't have enough early stage capital. We don't have enough seed capital. We don't have enough angel investors. We don't have enough follow-on capital. And the short answer is, so what? You're never going to have enough capital, ever. And part of the challenge of creating a startup community is that there's always going to be an imbalance between capital supply and capital demand. That's okay. That's not a problem. Really what you're trying to drive to in the context of the startup community is getting lots and lots and lots of new companies started with relatively small amount of capital, because your goal should be not to attract a whole bunch of capital so you can have a startup community. Your goal is the opposite. You want to have a startup community so you start attracting capital. And I think the mistake that a lot of people make is they say, well, we don't have enough venture capitalists here, so we've got to spend more time getting more venture capitalists here. Boulder doesn't have very many venture capitalists. My firm, Foundry Group, is there. There's a couple of other funds that have some capacity. But most of what's happened in Boulder in the last 6 or 7 years has been a function of angel investors and experienced entrepreneurs reinvesting in the system, seed investors from all over the country who view Boulder as a really attractive place to invest in startups. And then capital from all over the country that invests at the early and the mid stages that says, wow, there's some really good stuff going on here. I want to go pay attention to what's happening in this community. That's not something that just magically happened, because in 1995, when I moved to Boulder, the same issue existed. There just wasn't very much venture capital in Boulder. I do hear my friends that are the venture capitalists in Boulder also whine about there's not enough venture capital in Boulder, because some of those venture capitalists don't have funds to invest, so they're trying to figure out ways to get venture capital funds raised, whether it's by saying we need more in this geography or government should help us or something like that. And that's fine. it's just not a driver of the dynamic. The driver of the dynamic is if you have amazing companies getting started and a really robust community building, then you'll be in a position where capital comes to it. So I have a handful of other examples in the book that I talk about. And I also talk about in the book about problems that Boulder has. So I use Boulder as a very positive example, but Boulder, like every other dynamic system, has plenty of issues. And you know, I'll preview one, but I'll let you go deeper on them. We have a real problem with space in Boulder. It's a very small city, 100,000 people, and the downtown area, which is about 5 blocks by 10 blocks, is very, very dense in terms of the entrepreneurial activity. But there's almost virtually no available office space. So as a company grows and gets to 50 or 100 people, it has to either be very creative about how it deals with its office space, or it has to move out of Boulder, the core, which is where everybody wants to be. And there's a lot of tension around that dynamic because, of course, now you've got this situation of city government trying to control the footprint. You've got local real estate dynamics and the people that own the buildings and what their economic dynamics are and how they view the macro cycle and how they view entrepreneurs as tenants. And then you have entrepreneurs who are basically just trying to do whatever they can to minimize the friction associated with real estate while at the same time being located where they want in one place. So there's challenges like that that happen in the success curve, and I have no idea whether Boulder solves the particular challenges it has, but it's something that's interesting to continue to view over a long period of time, recognizing that we're dealing with a very, very dynamic system. So that's the broad overview on the book. I want to go ahead and do some Q&A now. Try to figure out the best way to do this.
Brad, you've actually had a couple questions come in. The first one is, how can a zero-sum community exist to support a non-zero-sum set of startups? In other words, the winners and losers.
So let me try to interpret the question. So if you assume that some companies succeed and some companies fail, recognize that most companies that are parts of a startup community essentially are going to be companies that are not geographically limited to that startup community. So I separate in the context of startups the difference between a small business and a startup. And the definition of a small business to me is the local company. The companies I'm talking about in the context of the startup community are high-growth companies that have national or international potential scope. And the interesting thing there is something I didn't touch on in the first 30 minutes that I think is worth highlighting is this notion of failure. Failure is an essential part of the entrepreneurial cycle. Companies fail all the time. Entrepreneurs who are very successful often have plenty of failure in their past. All of these things are a key part of the dynamic, and a community to be successful has to embrace the failure. We give an example in the book of something we do in Boulder. When a company fails, some of the entrepreneurs who are friends with the entrepreneurs who failed have a wake for the company and for the entrepreneurs. Take the entrepreneurs out to dinner, celebrate the effort, have a nice evening together, and then they move on and everybody says, okay, let's go do the next company. This isn't organized and structured. It's very chaotic and random and just sort of happens. But again, in the culture, the entrepreneurs all are looking out after their other entrepreneurial friends and making sure that everybody knows it's perfectly okay. So this idea that it's okay to fail allows people who have failure to continue to build in their own geography. And then on top of that, which I think is particularly compelling, is this notion of saturation. So in Boulder, we have an enormous amount of startup activity. We have, some geographic constraints, very, very tight employment base at this point in terms of new people in startups. It's very hard to hire engineers and very hard to hire certain types of people within startups because they're just all working. But because it's a non-zero-sum game, everybody's constantly working to get more people into the community. And this comes back to this notion of inclusiveness. So the idea that we're very inclusive means that when somebody shows up in town, it's not that one company tries to figure out a way to have a proprietary access to anybody new that comes into town. But instead what we do is the entrepreneurs are very aware that the goal is just to get more people into town. And some people are going to come work for company A and some will come work for company B and some work for company C, and that's fine because the people should be choosing which companies are the most important. The last is that there tends to be a fair amount of mobility between companies. So if someone's at a company and they're not happy, they're in a community where there's lots of other startups they can go to. And if any of you have ever worked in a situation where you weren't happy, you know it's not very satisfying. It's especially painful in an entrepreneurial context. But if you're working for the one startup in town or the two startups in town and you don't really feel like there's other places to go, it's very stifling. So we've worked hard at trying to develop that into the culture as well. Hopefully that helps with a couple of the thoughts.
Thanks, Brad. The next question is, you ask that entrepreneurs dedicate their time and energy to create incubators and accelerators while also running their own startups. How should they balance that?
Super important question. And I would say there's one very important framing and then a specific metaphor that I use. The framing is, it is not a requirement that all entrepreneurs be leaders of the startup community. Let me just go back to that. The requirement is that there be a critical mass of them. And a critical mass of them is probably a fraction of the total entrepreneurs in the startup community. But there does have to be a critical mass of people playing leadership roles. These leadership roles won't be full-time jobs because these entrepreneurs are running their companies. So the best way to think about it is the way Google thinks about 20% time. Google 20% time as a metaphorical construct is you work at Google and you get 20% of your time to work on whatever you want. And whatever you want, is probably relevant to Google, but it's whatever kind of project you want in the context of the company. In a startup community, the idea would be that you spend 20% of your time on the startup community. And I have some entrepreneurs who will say to me, well, what benefit do I get from that? And there's always going to be some people that are not going to get it, and that's fine. But here's a simple question that most people say, oh, I understand, is do you ever think you're ever going to hire another person in your company again? And if the answer is yes, then having a high profile within the startup community, being visible as a leader, having a company identity that's one that's identified with working hard at building your own community and being involved and giving before you get is an unbelievably powerful recruiting tool. So just on the basis of creating more visibility for your company for recruiting reasons is a reason to do it. Then sort of go down the list of all the other things sort of linked to that, around your product, around your service, around partnerships, around long-term reputation. Remember, this is a 20-year game. So the issue is that you're spending this 20% of your time, and it could be 10% of your time, there's no hard number, on a leadership role that is actually helping your company. So you're not doing something that is this complete parallel universe, but something that reinforces the business. The other part of that, and I'm a very, very, very deep believer in this, I believe in peer relationships and the value of peer relationships, especially in a mentoring context. I was involved in an organization when I was in my first company. I was 12. We had 12 people. It's about $1 million company, and I got involved in an organization now called Entrepreneurs Organization. It used to be called Young Entrepreneurs Organization. And it was the first time when I was in my mid-20s that I found my peer group. Like all of a sudden, I found other entrepreneurs who were going through the same stuff I was going through. And it was just awesome in terms of my own professional development to spend a little bit of time with those people, those peers of mine, and engaging with them in things where I learned about what they were doing in their business and their struggles and my struggles, and we could all sort of talk it through together and work on it together, and I had emotional support and functional support. The startup community is an incredible place to engage with your peers who are entrepreneurs. And so another benefit to you as a CEO or an entrepreneurial leader in your company or entrepreneur in your company is to all of a sudden have these very deep peer relationships with other entrepreneurs.
So, Brad, sort of leveraging off the same concept, the next question is, I recognize the importance of giving before you get. As a professional startup coach, I'm very involved in establishing a startup community where I live. But at a certain point, if a startup wants an advisor to be committed to the success of the startup also has to be willing to commit something. Considering that startups are cash poor, how do you create a win-win relationship between advisors and startups that are both value-added and serious?
So I think there's a bunch of things packed together in this question, which is something that I think is challenging. I'm going to use an example of a really valuable startup coach who I know and who I work with, or when I say I work with, I'm very close friends with, and he works with a number of companies. And I'll talk about him for a second as the example. So the person is Jerry Colonna. And Jerry was a very successful venture capitalist. He and I sat on some boards together and made investments together in the 90s. He retired from being a venture capitalist in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, and today is a CEO coach. He's really an entrepreneur coach. And he lives in New York. He has clients all around the country, but he essentially has become a very, very important touch point for a number of successful, very high-growth entrepreneurs as their coach. And in Jerry's situation, he's developed an incredible reputation around helping these entrepreneurs and these CEOs specifically navigate the growth dynamics of the company while also navigating their own personal dynamics. And in his particular case, he's able to charge a meaningful fee for those entrepreneurs on an hourly basis, the same way a lawyer, an accountant, or any other professional could. He is willing to spend time with people without them having to pay him, but he's very selective about who he takes on as clients. And so he views there as a separation between his clients and the broader set of people in the entrepreneurial universe who he's trying to reach. So I give that as an example of somebody who I think is highly functioning on that end of the spectrum. The problem is that there are many, many, many people who are at the other end of the spectrum as advisors who are not highly functioning or who are not dramatically impactful on the companies, and instead fall into this sort of murky universe of people who are building, building their a consulting business on the back of entrepreneurs and startups, which at some level is fine if, again, you're providing a lot of specific value. But it's murky in that there's an awful lot of people who are in that category who don't provide specific value, or who are looking for their next job because they're in between jobs, or who aren't really committed to trying to help the entrepreneurs, and instead sort of more focused on making a living, where they're making a living is to be helpful to entrepreneurs. So my suggestion in terms of the specific question, it's not to say there isn't value in it. It's to be really clear about where your value is. Second, to work extremely hard at developing a positive reputation that's very visible in the. And part of the way you do that is by giving before you get, by doing things that are visibly, publicly, before you start to ask for any sort of compensation. The compensation dynamics for cash poor startups, in many cases, will be equity. So the idea that as an advisor you're getting some equity for playing your role is fine. And depending on where you're playing the advisor role, right, if you're advising and helping on a sales basis, make it performance-based so that it really is linked back to the success of the company rather than just a fee that the startup has to decide upon. And then the last is, as a coach or as an advisor, whatever your role is, make sure that you're clearly delineating when you're helping somebody with no expectation versus when you're providing a service. Because I think one of the things that happens that messes up this dynamic is somebody provides a service for free with the idea that downstream they're going to get hired. And that's different than saying, no, I'm just helpful here. I'm not expecting anything back. Oh, yeah, I got it. Here's how I can help you with that, and here's what I would charge for. So separating those as clearly as you can, but making sure that you're contributing functionally into the system on the front end.
Thank you. This next question is a little bit Kansas City specific, but I think that it has sort of good broad implications related to technology. The question is, what is Brad's take on the Kansas City entrepreneurial community and potential for startups using Google Fiber?
So I don't know that I have deep views on the Kansas City startup community as of today. I will tell you that I know some entrepreneurs in Kansas City. I have seen some ups and downs of different efforts in Kansas City over the years. The last time I was in Kansas City, which was about a month ago, I met with a handful of different groups and entrepreneurs who were super jazzed about the things they were doing and were describing things very clearly from a leadership perspective. So Kansas City, to me, feels like a city that has enormous amount of potential and opportunity, has lots of things going on, certainly has all of the components needed to have a long-term, vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem, has some incredibly unique natural resources. I like to talk about natural resources as every city is different. In other words, your goal should not be to be like Boulder or to be like Silicon Valley or be like Seattle. The goal should be Kansas City should be an amazing thing that has its own unique characteristics that are special to Kansas City. And apply the principles that work from other startup communities, but build your own special magic thing. And Kauffman Foundation obviously is a natural resource. It's very powerful, that has a national purview, but a lot of focus locally. You have a really cool makerspace in Union Station that's being developed. You have a lot of good university infrastructure, that is concentrated in the geography. Again, that can be leveraged to natural resources. Of course, the historical base of telecommunications and pharma businesses help. So you build off these natural resources, and you see the entrepreneurs playing into providing leadership using and leveraging those natural resources. I know that's a general answer versus specific answer about Kansas City, but I don't feel like I've made a study of Kansas City, so I don't feel qualified to be an expert on it. In fact, if you are of Kansas City, turn it around and take the principles and think about what they mean. Now, here's an important second point before I talk about Google Fiber. I was in Boise last week, and I'd been in Boise 3 years ago, and I gave a talk at their annual technology awards, something or other, entrepreneur, great, wonderful, celebrate 700 people, a dinner event. That's what I call them. They're all the same to me now. They're useful and important events in the community, but they're not a necessary activity. Or sorry, they're not a sufficient condition. They're necessary activity, not a sufficient condition for creating a strong startup community. And the event in Boise was great. It was well put on. It was well attended. And at the end of the event, somebody asked a question, and the question was, "Hey, Brad, you were here 3 years ago in 2010. It's now end of 2012. How are we doing?" And my answer was, "I don't know, and I don't care." And the reason was, check back in 2032. Go back to this long-term game. Did I actually know how they were doing? Sure, I had opinions about things that were going well and not going well, and people that I knew there, and stuff that was happening, and you could point at lots of things that were successful and lots of things that needed to be done and lots of things that weren't working. But the idea that you need to measure yourself against yourself every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, or measure yourself against another community is totally unnecessary. And instead, focus on just playing a long-term game where you're building something meaningful. It's so much more powerful. Google Fiber is an incredible natural resource. You have this gigantic company that's chosen the region as a place to try an experiment with a level of connectivity that has very, very interesting potential implications for technologies. So it's a thing that you can recognize as a natural resource and play around with. And any natural resource that's new is going to have plenty of things that don't work and issues and people arguing about it and fighting over it, and especially when you're talking about infrastructure. So it's an interesting opportunity for a couple of entrepreneurs to try to figure out what would happen if you had this kind of connectivity, this kind of performance in other cities that were the size of Kansas City, and provide some intellectual and functional leadership around that. So I just view it as another powerful input that those of you in the startup community should try to incorporate.
Thanks, Brad. We have time for about 2 more questions. We have several more, though, so I'll send these to you separately to consider answering. But going on to the next question, do you think an accelerator focused mostly on social entrepreneurs can make financial sense?
Absolutely. There's one in Boulder called the Unreasonable Institute. It's modeled after Techstars. It's awesome. So, yes.
Perfect.
I'll be quick on the questions.
That's great. One more then. Do you feel that the often lack of coordination and communication, meaning the mayhem and duplication of effort, between Boulder feeders like CU and the community needs work, or is it just the way things work? Does it contribute to the system or often detract?
Get used to the idea that startups and entrepreneurship is one glorious mess. And the mess has tons of redundancy. The mess has tons of complexity. Oh, how funny, I just found the questions. The mess has plenty of complexity. The dynamic that you're dealing with is always going to be redundant, is always going to be sloppy, is chaotic, has things that are suboptimal, that are underfunded, that are rough, that are last minute, that are ad hoc. That's awesome. I mean, that's just how it should be. That's how startups are. And startup community should be that way too. Stuff's constantly getting tried. If it doesn't work, kill it, try something else. There's lots and lots of things that are similar in effort. Sometimes they end up merging. Sometimes they end up satisfying different people. Sometimes they just simply overlap and it amplifies it. So I think that there is a point where there's probably, too many of the same thing, but the problem is not one that you have to manage top down. If there's too many of the same thing, people will go to the ones that are most interesting, and the ones that aren't will, die a natural death. And the key is to let that happen, is to not to hang on to the stuff that's not working. Because what you want to do is you want to repurpose that energy into something different, something new, something that's additive. But embrace the mess.
Perfect. Brad, thank you so much. Having had an opportunity already to read the book, I just found it to be incredibly inspiring, insightful, and exciting. So I hope that everybody will take a look at the book, and I so appreciate you joining us today. I do have a few announcements for the FastTrac community. As you know, global entrepreneurship is coming up very quickly. For those of you who may not know, GEW is now in 120 countries and will take place this November 12th through 18th. And as part of the celebration, FastTrac wants to support you, our affiliates, with events going on around the world. We have created step-by-step guidelines for entrepreneurial meetups. These meetups will help to support sales at small businesses in your communities and encourage networking among entrepreneurs who are also FastTrac graduates. So absolutely supporting the notion that Brad talks about in his book. Expect to see more information coming out soon. We will be providing a toolkit with ideas for hosting meetups in your communities. The meetups we hope will take place on Wednesday, November 14th. So stay tuned for more information coming. Additionally, I hope that you will all mark your calendars for our next author series event. It will feature Philip Bruton, who will discuss his book, The Art of the Sale, and it will be held on Wednesday, November 7th. Again, more information to follow. Many of you have asked if this session will be available for replay. It will. We hope to have it up within about a week, and you'll receive a follow-up email with this link. Additionally, the Kauffman Foundation just created one of its sketchbooks on Brad's book, so we will include a link to that as well, including a link to a place that you can actually purchase his book. I look forward to talking with all of you next month. If you have any questions, please be sure to contact us at info@fasttrac.org, and we will talk to you again on November 7th. Thanks so much for joining us today.